so much, Andrew and John, for having me. I'm Alan Arthur. I'm from Solutions Journalism Network. If you're not familiar with us, we sort of spread the practice of and train people in reporting just as rigorously on how people are responding to problems as we do on problems themselves. So instead of just climate change is going to kill us all, well, who's making progress and how are they doing it and what can we learn from it? For elections, generally what we've been doing for the past couple of years actually is a giant initiative called Renewing Democracy, where we've funded, we're getting close to now our goal of 100 projects dedicated to progress in the machinery of democracy is how we sort of broadly define it. So places where people are increasing voter turnout, increasing civic engagement, things like that. Right now, what we're doing is we have a cohort of 12 or 13 newsrooms where we've combined with the Citizens Agenda and Hearken to focus on not just engaging communities, finding out their info needs, but then turning that also into solutions reporting. So using that to vet candidates' proposals. So they say they want to do something. Has it been successful somewhere else? How did that work? Or if they don't have a plan for things, asking why. Somebody else solved it, how come you're not solving it? And using that to kind of sharpen accountability and focus on people's actual priorities around the election as opposed to just what politicians say. So that's what we're doing right now. And I'm really delighted to be here. Happy to answer any questions and have this conversation with you.
Awesome, thank you, Alan. So yeah, let's get started. So I'll start with the broad picture and then I'll introduce our guests. So basically, as everyone probably has realized, this year's brought a lot more attention to the processes that support our democracy, namely the administration of elections, like in other words, who can vote, when they can vote, and how they can vote. So, and then the pandemic and uncertainty around that electoral system means that all these questions have been complicated in the short term. There's some interesting stats and data out there, some of which I included in a report I published today about the information needs of voters, and I'll summarize some bullet points on that front. But one thing that Pew Research found is that almost 50% of voters they surveyed expected to have some difficulties casting a ballot this year, which is a significant rise from 2018's election cycle. There was a poll earlier this year by Next Gen America, which is a Democratic-leaning group, that found that more than half of voters under the age of 35 say they don't have the resources or knowledge they need to vote by mail in November, with lots of attention being focused on mail voting and the Postal Service. It's also worth pointing out that research from All Voting is Local, which is a voting rights nonprofit, suggested that Black and Hispanic voters in Philadelphia were less likely to vote by mail than white voters in Pennsylvania's June primary. And of those voters who did vote by mail, white voters submitted their ballot requests on average 10 days earlier than Black and Hispanic voters, which obviously prompts concerns about from election experts and advocacy groups that some voters may not receive or return their ballots by election day. I'm sure you guys have all seen these conversations happening on social media. So this is all to say, while journalists have been providing renewed attention to the mechanics of voting, the message may not be getting through to all potential voters. It'll take multiple approaches to reach all of our audiences and potential audiences. So that's why we're so excited today to host this conversation today about understanding and responding to the information needs of voters. To help us with that, we're joined today by journalists with unique insight into this beat and into this topic. Roxanne Patel Shepelavy is the executive editor of the Philadelphia Citizen, a nonprofit newsroom that centers the public's role in civic life using solutions-based journalism. Asraa Mustufa, the former managing editor of the Chicago Reporter and soon-to-be digital editor of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, that is a mouthful, ICIJ, who helped launch the collaborative audience-focused Shy Vote Election Guide in Chicago's 2019 municipal elections. And Rainesford Stauffer, a freelance reporter who's written about youth civic engagement and voting for the New York Times and elsewhere. So we're so glad to have these folks today. I'm going to get started with Roxanne. The Philadelphia Citizen, at its core, seems driven by the idea that people should participate actively in their communities, and to do that, they need actionable information. Can you talk a bit about how the Citizen thinks about its mission and fostering civic solutions and civic engagement in the context of covering elections and providing information to voters?
Sure. So the Citizen is, we're a 5-year-old nonprofit civic-minded media outlet. And we combine solutions-based journalism and events with calls to civic action, with the goal of empowering our readers to become actively engaged citizens in the city of Philadelphia. So we're sort of the larger mission is sort of reviving democracy in the American city where it was born. And John, you talked about this look at Philadelphia, and in the context of voting, Philadelphia is incredibly important because we are the biggest voting, we're the biggest city in Pennsylvania, which is in every election considered a swing state, including this one. In 2016, the election here was decided by less than 50,000 votes. And all those votes could have come from the city of Philadelphia. And so just to sort of put that in perspective, when we talk about voting in Philadelphia, we're talking about, when we're talking about national elections, you're talking about, the national election potentially hinging on voters in Philadelphia. Slightly overstating it, but there is that kind of a sense here. Having said that, we are local, and we really, really emphasize the fact that every single year is an election year, and that local elections matter really to some degree more even than national elections. So all of the sort of the heat and energy is around presidential year elections. In 2016, I think 60-something% of Philadelphians came out to vote, which was significantly less than 4 years earlier, or enough less than 4 years earlier, I should say. But in the last mayoral election, which was last year, only about 25% of people came out to vote. So that's appalling, right? So what we really focus on in the Citizen are the things that you can do to make Philadelphia a better place for everybody who lives in it.
I have to do one thing.
And one of the really important things that we emphasize for that is you can vote. And so next year is kind of a nothing year of an election nationally, but we have a district attorney's race next year, right? We have a city controller's race next year. And so we really try to frame this question of voting around this idea of being engaged in your community and telling people and really explaining to people and having them sort of feel and understand or participate in the fact that what happens in Philadelphians' day-to-day lives is really most affected by what happens in City Hall. And so that is the sort of framing that we really use.
Great, thank you. I think that sounds like similar framing to what Asraa did with the Shy Voter Guide. So you took that similar audience-driven approach for Chicago's municipal election in 2019, offering multiple pathways into the election for voters or people considering voting, and targeting across the collaboration multiple audiences within the city. How did Shy Vote get started, and what was the mindset going into developing this project, especially considering in mind which we'll link to the homepage. The homepage is so elegant in its simplicity and really is inviting in that sense. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so municipal election last year in Chicago was really overwhelming. Like, Chicago kind of is a city where usually the one mayor serves for a very long time, but last year was kind of unusual. There was, there's always 50 ward races in a municipal election. Chicago split up into 50 different wards. So that was like 238 different candidates and 17 candidates for the mayor's office alone. So like, we were overwhelmed trying to adequately cover all these candidates. So of course, like, people trying to vote and get informed on all these different possibilities, we could imagine how much information overload they were going through. There was also like a corruption probe going on where a lot of key members of the city council. So that was kind of like, I don't want to say overshadowing, but kind of competing for attention, because a lot of people that were running for re-election, a lot of prominent names running for re-election were also involved in this federal investigation. So we wanted to do something that was comprehensive, but could offer signal in a very noisy election. And we kind of decided that, like, in just some context, Shy Vote was 10 local organizations. All of us were small, independent. Most of us are nonprofits. So a lot of like small and scrappy shops. So we kind of decided, for both capacity reasons and for like the approach we were going for, that writing 238 articles or, you know, whatever. Just doing articles was not going to be the solution we wanted to give to our audiences. So came up with this guide. And as John mentioned, it starts out with like different pathways, because we wanted to respect the fact that like elections actually aren't one size fits all. People are coming at it from different entry points. So you might be like someone that's new to the city, you might be a student that's in the city for a short time, you might be a long-time resident. So I think building that into the design of acknowledging the different entry points, but also designing something that was comprehensive but had enough thorough verified information that even like, you know, someone super informed could learn more, or, you know, get more information by using our voter guide. So I think like the goal was to make it a walkthrough from the logistics of like, are you registered? Where do you vote? What are the hours? How does early voting work? What do you need to bring to the polls? To the candidates themselves, and then to, you know, and then of course information, deep dives on the candidates themselves. I would say for like, it's analogous, I would say kind of, as Roxanne was saying, it's kind of analogous to like the local races in this year's election. So it's a lot of the same challenges this year that we had in a municipal election in 2019. It's like, who's running? There's certain in addition, there's the presidential race, which is kind of like the mayoral race in Chicago. There's like a lot of attention, a lot of coverage at that highest level race. But then there's a lot of races down ballot that are like, you know, there's legislative bodies, not federal legislative bodies, and local legislative bodies, and there's ballot measures, and there's all kinds of things that depend on your geography, but these are also unfamiliar geographies. Like I think a lot of people don't know the boundaries of their congressional district, for example. In Shy Vote, like the first thing we realized was that most people don't know what ward they're in because they don't actually line up with any familiar landmarks of neighborhoods. So like the first thing we did was like, type in your address and we'll tell you what ward you're in, and it'll take you to like the candidates that apply to your ward. So, and then the other thing is participation. Roxanne was also saying that I think in 2016, there was a study that more than 30% of voters nationally don't fill out the whole ballot, and voter participation in local elections in Chicago is historically and infamously low. So I think that was kind of like why we came together to try to come up with something that's like a comprehensive guide that's very clear from like bolts to nuts of someone participating in the election. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I mean, and it is very different from the typical horse race coverage that we're so used to. And on that point, I want to turn it over to Rainesford, who covered this from a different angle on the information, specifically the information needs of voters, namely how community and political organizers are finding success with engaging young people by focusing on issues important to them, and how to be involved in the broader political system, something that, again, Shiva did well. Can you talk a little bit about this organizing approach, and that doesn't necessarily begin with voting and its impact on young people?
Definitely. I think first I've got to preface this by saying there's so many incredible reporters and so many incredible researchers doing work around this right now with the youth vote in particular. So by no means just me, but something that came up time and time again in conversations that I had starting back in February all the way through the summer was this idea of investment. And it seems to young people that takes really different forms in terms of going beyond the voting process or not just using it as a starting place. There's a feeling of lack of investment and sustained engagement from politicians and political parties, which leaves some young people feeling as though they're being checked in on every election year and otherwise just kind of not heard from at all. But what stood out to me was this even felt true to them, at least to the young people I spoke to, in terms of media. We see a lot of stories about Gen Z coming to save us all, or young people sort of becoming a trendy audience for politicians to sort of court to get them to turn out to vote during high profile or really high stakes elections. And instead of earning a vote or covering how young people vote, that can come across as kind of checking a box rather than the sustained, meaningful engagement that I think young people are really craving. And similarly, I think that puts them in a position when we're focusing more on turnout and less on issues that get get them to turn out, it puts young people in a position where they're sort of the recipients of what people are giving them instead of a very diverse cohort with wildly different experiences. And so what stood out to me when I was talking to young organizers who are the ones out doing this work in their communities was that when you start from a place of everyday issues that young people are feeling and experiencing on the ground every day, from police violence to healthcare to climate change to unaffordable housing, the list could just go on and on, it makes voting feel like a step or a means to actually change these things rather than just doing something because you're supposed to do it. And what stood out in those conversations is that these young organizers were prioritizing making voting human. And so they were starting with issues that young adults were experiencing firsthand. They were also focused a lot on local politics and local elections to make things more sustainable. And I think by starting there, it makes politics feel personal to them. So it's not, you know, a party every 2 years or 4 years that they may or may not be invited to, but something they really get to create and shape. And while it was for a different story, I did some reporting last year on young people working to turn out their peers in areas that tended to not be as civically engaged. And there's one quote from a young person in rural Kentucky that I think about literally once a week. And I'm paraphrasing, but he said, you know, come to my town and tell a young person working full-time for $7.25 an hour, going to school and supporting their family, that they need to be more politically involved. And that captured so much of why the voting process for young people and the information surrounding it needs to be more than it's important, go vote. Peer-to-peer connection and sustained engagement were really critical strategies that I think young people definitely want from politics and from voting, but I think they also want it from journalists and media.
So at these things, there's always these big ideas, and then every journalist is sitting around going, this sounds great. How do I do this? So Roxanne, we're obviously huge fans of your work at SJN. How do you actually go out and identify, and this is especially difficult during the pandemic, how do you actually identify and understand the needs, the information needs that your audience has? And then how does that guide your actual editorial work?
So I guess there's a couple answers to this. I mean, the sort of general answer is that the problems in Philadelphia are not a secret, right? So, you know, Philadelphia is the poorest big city in America. We have a 25% poverty rate. We have, and all of the things that go with that, right? And so we have maybe now, I don't know, Chicago, we're sort of like, we're neck and neck with, you know, our homicide rate. Like there's all of these things that are they're not hidden problems, right? And so this idea of doing local solutions means that we spend a lot of time looking for solutions to these big problems in Philadelphia. And you know, you popped into the chat here our Ideas We Should Steal column that we do. And so a lot of what we do is really looking for places around the world that have solved the problems that we face here in Philadelphia. And what we found is that our audience really appreciates that. And, you know, to do a plug for the solutions thing, you know, part of what we do that's different is we do offer solutions, which we found that readers really appreciate. And so they want to know what to do about these problems. And then the other piece that we do is we put in a little button to every story that says, it's called Do Something. And that is the call to action. So if you are engaged in the story, we are giving you a way that you can take it further. And what we have found from talking to our readers, doing surveys, is that something like 60% of them said that they actually do something based on the Do Something button on our stories, which was like a surprisingly delightful number to discover. So we have a really engaged audience, I think, gets us the point. And what they're looking for clearly are the ways that they can get involved in being sort of better citizens of Philadelphia. And so when we talk about voting, we also realize that from talking to them that our readers are voters, right? And so what we do is sort of to Asraa's point that there are people who come to this from all different parts of the voting spectrum. You know, we give our readers the tools they need to be able to go out and vote themselves. But we started to realize that that's not enough, right? So what we need to do is also give them the tools for getting other people to vote. And so that's what we've also started to do, to sort of make it so that our readers who are already civically engaged can also take what they know and be engaged on this issue of voting outside of themselves. And we've done that by surveying them, by looking at what people read. I mean, it's as simple as knowing that when we put up an election guide, even if we just put one up last week and already tons of people are reading it to figure out what's going on in the November election, right? And so we are able to look and see what people are looking at. And then I will say there's a caveat here, which is that our audience has doubled in 2020. It's just, there's like a crazy need for journalism, thankfully for all of us. And so we don't know all the needs of our audience, and we are, we're trying to figure out how to do that. And I think it's, you have to go and you have to actually ask people what it is they need in order to be the best citizens that they can. And so we're in the process of trying to do that too.
That's great, and they always say, engagement is a process, not a product. So it's always ongoing.
Sure.
You're always learning new stuff.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I saw Ashley Alvarado speak from KPCC, and they were talking about their voter guide. And Asraa, you said something that really reminded me of this. She said, we had this really grand, ambitious plan. We're going to make this amazing voting guide, and it was going to be all this stuff. And then we went out to find out what people actually needed. And the information they actually needed was, how do I vote? Who are the candidates? Where am I? Where do I vote? Who's in my district? Like stuff that was basic that they would have thought like, everybody kind of knows this. So a similar question for you as with Roxanne is, how did you actually assess what info your audience needed, and then how did you work that into the final product? And then sort of sub question is, how did people respond to it? Was it positive? Could you tell whether people were using it or not?
Yeah, just like taking a step back, like when you're defining what people need or what you want to provide, sometimes it can also be clarifying to know what you're not positioned to provide or you're not interested in providing, because elections are like such a wide gamut of coverage. So I mean, a couple of people have touched on this on the call. I think like in Chicago politics, and I think it's as relevant to how federal politics are also covered, it's almost covered like an insider game between power brokers. It's like endorsements, the horse race, polls, sound bites, who raised the most money from who. And, not that coverage is not important, but it really does it makes the audience feel like a spectator to this like dance between power brokers. And it might sound like cheesy or idealistic to say that we really wanted to design it to make the voters or people reading the election guide feel like the power brokers. So that was kind of the number one thing. And exactly what you were saying, people wanted to know like very, basic thing. They kind of wanted to demystify the process as much as they wanted to demystify like understanding the distinctions between the candidates. So even things like, the other good thing we had was like very open, because there were 10 organizations involved, and this was like our main thing we were working on for like the 10-week election period. We had direct communication. We're able to quickly implement people's suggestions. So we put like early voting locations, and somebody was like, I don't know what time it's open. And we're like, oh, it's actually open at 6 a.m. And they didn't know. So we put in like the hours and the location and like the dates. So like very nitty gritty practical things that could help a person navigate how to like fit in voting into their day or their busy week. That was a big one. And I think like the reaction was really strong. I mean, it's somewhat anecdotal, but people were saying like, the only reason I voted was because of the election guide, because the one piece of feedback I heard from a couple of people that was surprising to me is that some voters actually didn't want to vote in the municipal election because they knew so little about the candidates and the processes. They actually felt like it would be irresponsible to vote because they don't know anything about what an alderman is, how city council works, what are these people's histories. Chicago's a very democratic town, so like the normal signals of red or blue don't apply when it comes to local politics. So I think, yeah, the feedback was really strong. It was a very short project, like from start to finish. We started like 4 weeks before the first election. Chicago's a runoff system, so there's 2 election days. It's complicated, but we started 4 weeks before, and the holidays, like the Christmas holiday was like in the middle of that, and we still were able to get the equivalent of like 15% of Chicago voters used our election guide. So which was, you know, a big ramp up for like a project that was put together pretty hastily in a big city. So yeah, I would say the feedback was good, and it just gave us a lot of, I can get to this later, it gave us a lot of ideas of how we wanted to kind of incorporate this approach in our year-round coverage and not just make it like a limited thing. Because one thing what we all were kind of like, that it dawned on us as the whole election came to a close, is that for all of the resources that newsrooms put into election guides, they actually expire on election night, and you kind of are back to business as usual, or you don't have to be. Like, you know, ideally you're taking what you learned, or you know, gleaning what actually registered or what worked with your audience, and hopefully using that to influence your year-round coverage. But that's pretty challenging, and I can talk about that a little bit more later, to take what works in terms of civic engagement type reporting and coverage and applying it to your routine coverage, and not just making it like the special occasion of an election.
It's a great point. Ideally, your election coverage will help inform. A lot of people are like, it's election season, and like they do a thing and then that's it, and then it ends, and then they move, and it's so distinct. But ideally, especially if you're doing engagement or solution stuff, you can take, or this kind of like info needs assessment, you can take it out into your general reporting. And this is a perfect segue, because Rainesford, I wanted to ask you, you know, you're listening to a lot of young voters. What are you hearing about their info needs? And in the spirit of solutions journalism, what is actually helping them meet those needs? Like, what's working in terms of actually meeting those needs and helping them vote?
I just want to echo first what everyone else has said, that something I hear a lot from young people is, I don't feel like I have enough information on candidates, especially in local elections, to go vote. I feel irresponsible. I feel not engaged with the process enough to even participate in it. So I think that base level of how to and who to vote for based on their platforms might even be more important than why they should go vote. The young people I've spoken to from all different backgrounds have a good sense of why, in theory, they need to turn out to vote, but there does seem to be an info gap on the logistics of how that actually happens. I was thinking back to, I think it was a July report conducted with Gallup by the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, that looked at young adults ages 18 to 29, which reported that 3 in 10 young people surveyed did not know if they could register to vote online. And I think voter suppression and lack of information has always been an issue, including for this demographic of young people. And now COVID has created a lot of additional chaos within that. Just anecdotally, in interviews talking to young voters, social media has come up a lot. They are following their national and local news outlets on social media, and they do want to be engaged in that way, but they're also following their peers and organizers and YouTubers who they feel like relate to them. There's actually a huge push for Instagram to give this swipe up option on stories to everybody. And I talked to a lot of young people who felt like that would actually be a very big thing in terms of getting information to their peers on how to vote and who to vote for. So sometimes I think it's things as simple as that. I also think that means that social media platforms need to be a lot more vigorous about disinformation and misinformation that's happening on their platforms, because young people are really paying attention. In terms of solutions, I've gotten a lot of questions from young adults about how-to guides where it's bare bones basics. How do I vote? How do I learn who to vote for? How do I develop a political ideology that isn't just what I'm hearing from my teachers or my parents? How do I kind of unpack these things myself? And a lot of times I end up referring them to organizers who can speak to this on a more peer-to-peer level, and the voter turnout work they're doing is incredible, where it's everything from social media and voter registration links on Animal Crossing to TikTok. But something that came up time and time again is that not only should it not be hard to vote, it also shouldn't be this difficult to find out how to vote. And I think when young people see things, whether it's packages of stories or Instagram or live events that are tailored to them, I think they recognize that they are supposed to be engaged by these things. They want people to reach out to them directly. And so I think in terms of solutions, that's the biggest thing, is not letting them get lost in the shuffle of other audiences, but having things that feel engaging and tailored and meaningful to them.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes me think that there was an example that we saw before of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel specifically creating shareable graphics that would go in their Instagram stories. And obviously those can flood out to other folks with just basic information on voting in the primary in Wisconsin. Just an example of something of going to where they are and making it something that's easily consumable by an audience that you normally wouldn't cater to. Or consider, or just working against those assumptions. And on that note, I do want to focus a bit, continue to focus more on journalists, especially at the local level, and how they can translate some of these concepts and some of the philosophies that went into your products into practice. So I want to make sure to give each of you some time to answer, but first I'll ask what challenges or barriers might journalists anticipate in trying to reach and support new audiences this year? And I can maybe start with Asraa, since there's a really good example with ShyVote, something that you really got, that in reading about it got me thinking, was the fact that y'all translated ShyVote into Spanish, which seems like, which is a very commendable thing to do, but it didn't necessarily get the engagement you were expecting. Are there similar barriers or other things we should be thinking about when creating products that way?
Yeah, I think I can just speak specifically to our experience with trying to make more of our news products available in Spanish, because Chicago has a large Spanish-speaking population. I would say it's kind of like what I was saying before, in that you want to think of these efforts as like year-round and not like a special occasion. So yeah, even though Univision Chicago, which is a huge broadcast company, was our partner, I think we weren't deliberate enough about, you know, they had a heavy lift in terms of making this available in Spanish and providing the translation and stuff, but then we weren't as focused on the distribution with the Spanish audience. So even though it was all available in Spanish, we didn't get that much traffic on the Spanish version. But then since then, we've continued to partner with Univision specifically and kind of like deepen our relationship with their producers and understood more of how their audience actually reaches them. So I can just give a contrasting example. We've, with our COVID coverage, we've made a lot of like COVID-19 graphics and trackers, and also made most of them available in Spanish. And then with Univision, we kind of had more deliberate conversations with their producers and realized that a lot of their audience is getting their content through push notifications. So we kind of had to find our way to the people that manage that on their team. And the traffic has been, the Spanish language traffic on the COVID trackers has been like almost on par with the English, the English language trackers. So I think it's just like, first of all, thinking of any partner that you're bringing on to increase, if you're able to increase the linguistic diversity, make sure you don't just treat them as a translation partner. They should really be in terms of shaping the product and distributing it and how it's designed. They you know, it's a lot to ask. I feel like you can inadvertently make a second language partner become almost like a second-class citizen, because they're carrying so much of the translation work, but they're not, which prevents them from having an equal seat at the table in terms of development, design, distribution, strategy. So I think like we learned that the hard way in a sense, but we're able to like in subsequent efforts build on that relationship and have much better results. So hopefully, you know, with future election coverage, we're better integrated, we better understand how their audience works, and hopefully that'll get us better results and better reach moving forward.
Awesome. Yeah. And I mean, and I think that's what I kind of love about this, about your philosophy, is that it's iterable and you can continue to, you know, work on this and think about this and think how to do it next time. But it's definitely a matter of like getting started. Roxanne, anything you want to add about trying to reach and support new audiences? Any barriers or challenges with that?
Well,
especially any assumptions that you guys work against?
Well, so we have a sort of a complicated thing here in Pennsylvania, because last year it's been more difficult to vote here than it has been in other states until the end of last year, when the state legislature passed a whole bunch of voting reform laws just in time for the pandemic, which is great. But there is a huge information gap, because people don't actually know, like your traditional way of voting, which was in Pennsylvania, you had to register 4 weeks in advance and then show up at your local polling place, and that was pretty much your only way to vote. Is different now, right? So now there's mail-in voting. Now you only have to register 2 weeks in advance. There's even places where you can sort of register and vote at the same time. There's going to be a lot fewer in-person voting places because we don't have poll workers. And so everybody in some sense is a new audience for this, because there is so much new information. And so what we are sort of, and then you get, you know, the sort of national news about like, well, voting by mail means your vote's not going to get counted. And so what we have really struggled to do, and I think this is common to like all the local media outlets in Philadelphia, is to translate for all of our readers what these laws mean to them as this moves, as you know, the legislature sort of makes adjustments because of the pandemic. As there's lawsuits about you can't have a drop-off box, you know, there's like all this stuff that we're still working through that we would have been working through anyway that is now complicated. And so every piece of it, and this gets back to that sort of like basic information that we didn't used to need to give people, we now finally have to give people. And so that's the sort of constant thing that we're chasing, right? And so we're continuously putting that information out in as many different formats as we can. And we partner with a lot of there's a lot of organizations in Philly that, for example, there's a huge youth voter initiative in Philadelphia to get young people voting, registered and voting there. And then, you know, you see that, oh, but you have to have a driver's license to do that. Oh, but kids in Philadelphia don't vote. And so there's like all these little problems that come up that we keep having to sort of address. And so we are, it's kind of a moving target, I guess is the point.
Definitely feel you on the moving target part. That's yeah, constantly moving those goalposts.
Yeah.
What about you, Rainesford? What do you think about barriers and challenges for the youth vote this year? Do you feel like the problem's getting the attention it deserves, or does it need a little bit more?
Absolutely. I think this is an interesting question because I keep seeing a lot of coverage about why young people vote, why they should vote, a lot of debate about how they will or will not influence the election. And based on conversations I've had, I think that that's kind of missing the mark a little. The two things that keep coming up in these conversations back and forth with young adults and young organizers is that, one, it's not a matter of whether young people will influence politics, because especially as we're seeing right now in our current moment, they already have and they're going to continue to do so. And it's our responsibility to make sure they have the information they need to go out and make informed decisions at the ballot box as well. The other thing that I think is really important in this conversation is that young people are the experts of their own experience. And I think just like it's hard to conceptualize going to vote without ever seeing yourself represented by a candidate or in a candidate's platform or priorities, it's hard to imagine your voice mattering or making a difference if you never see yourself represented in any of the places where you would go to learn more about that, whether that's, you know, an Instagram account, whether that's your local paper. And that's something I've seen time and time again, is that just like the youth vote itself, we know is not a trendy gimmick. It's not going to just be Generation Z. Eventually there'll be generations coming up behind them. Prioritizing young people's stories and perspectives isn't either. And I think if we want information to be accessible and relevant to young people, that means talking to them and engaging them on these issues on a sustained basis about what's challenging them, about what's changing their minds, about what they're thinking about our current political climate or issues that are impacting them on a day-to-day basis. I was just on a call this morning, actually, where young people were discussing the idea of media and trust, which we all know is a big issue right now. And for them, I think it seems like at least some of that trust and knowing that this media outlet or my local paper, or whatever the case may be, is my go-to source for information, comes from seeing themselves not just represented to check a box, but valued as contributors to their community, to politics in terms of voting, to their local media landscape, whatever the case may be. So I think that something on my mind in terms of a solution is bringing more young people into the process of reporting on all this to figure out really where the barriers to information and accessibility are coming in and letting them steer some of those conversations.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, as Tom said, that's a great point. I think some of this is some of this issue with, like, we're still diagnosing the problem in the middle of trying to fix it. Like, in other words, trying to build the plane and fly it too. And I'm curious if there's anything else that journalists can do to better reach and serve these audiences in the short term. Is there any way to get like started or proceed on this front in the coming weeks?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, either surprisingly or completely unsurprisingly, the most popular page by far on ShyVote was the FAQ, which broke down like the procedure of voting and, you know, early voting, registration, all the different steps of participating in an election. And I think the page was super simple. It was just like an FAQ. It was just text on a web page. So it was very easy to produce, and like and it was by far the most successful traffic wise in the whole ShyVote interface. And I think this year, one of the last things I got to work on as I wrap things up at the Reporter was actually we've been partnering a lot with WBZ, which is the NPR affiliate in Chicago, and Paula Friedrich, who I think is on this call. She's the Interactors producer there, and so she had this idea of like request your mail-in ballot tool, because there's a lot of coverage about this whole mail-in, if you want to call it a controversy, like, does the Postal Service have the capacity to handle it? Is there potential for fraud? Will this favor the Democrats? A lot of states like Illinois, and it sounds like Pennsylvania, have introduced, have had try to have legislation to expand it in time. And so a lot of coverage about the whole specter of mail-in voting, but less information again on the process. So the other thing is that mail-in voting is technically available to everybody, but the process is not uniform across the state. So for example, a lot of rural election authorities, they're so small that they don't have the option to request your application online. You have to mail in your application. So Paula was able to design this. It actually hasn't been published yet, so I think it's going up tomorrow. But where you could pick your location, and then it kind of tells you the step-by-step and the rules, and kind of tries to address some of the common concerns. So again, I think like the emphasis on the process seems to be like a common theme here. And again, if you have the luxury of an awesome Interactors producer like Paula, then you can make it super nifty. But even just like text on a page can be really compelling in your own CMS. Just like a clean layout and hyperlinks can be a huge improvement on what these government websites offer in terms of helping people figure out how to vote. I bring up this example like all the time, but there was this really popular election guide. It was actually a progressive election guide, so it wasn't completely nonpartisan, but it was called Girl, I Guess. And it was just a Google Doc that went viral on it was actually first on the midterm election, and they created subsequent iterations. But the big like takeaway for me for that was that it doesn't get more bare bones in terms of layout and how many bells and whistles things have than a Google Doc, but it was clearly highly effective and resonated with a lot of people just because the information was so clear and concise and structured in a way that was engaging. I can drop a link about that one. So yeah, that was my kind of like, in terms of applying the lessons of ShyVote to the unique challenges of this election. That was kind of like where we were headed with trying to do this for the election this fall.
You just made me think of El Tipano in Oakland, where it's literally just, I mean, it is the most bare bones to text messaging service for Spanish speakers looking for practical journalism like this. Like, how do I do this thing? Who do I call about this thing? Or Outlier Media in Detroit, where they're literally just texting people. I mean, the visual stuff is great if you can do it, but that should not stop you. If you're like, I need to address these needs, the fact that you don't have a shiny production should not prevent you from doing this.
Yeah, I think too that there is a little bit of building the plane and flying it in understanding why it is that people aren't voting. And there's at least here, and I think everywhere, a lot of misinformation about who is even able to vote. So aside from the question of why people aren't voting, like politicians aren't speaking to me, or I don't know how to do it, there's also this misinformation about who's able to vote. And as an example, in 2018, we had a gubernatorial race in Pennsylvania, and our current governor, who clearly was trying to get a certain vote, had the Philadelphia rapper Meek Mill endorse him in an ad. And what Meek said was, I mean, I'm on probation. I don't even know if I can vote, but if I was able to vote, I would vote for Tom Wolf. And it was so incredibly maddening because, in fact, he is able to vote. And clearly the governor didn't care enough to actually fact check that. But that sort of information that's out there is incredibly confusing. And I think that a service that, like, there's a whole population of people who might actually vote, who might be really civically engaged people, but aren't going to the ballot box because they actually don't know that they are able to vote. And somehow, we're not teaching that in schools. We're not, that information is not getting out there. And so part of what I think we can do as journalists is do like a fast on who can vote, but I'm not going to reach everybody, right? So part of it is amplifying the work that community organizations are already doing around this, because there are organizations in the neighborhood who are working to make sure that people understand if they can vote. And so I think that one of the things that we can do is shine a light on the people who are doing this work, because that also sends a message to everybody else who reads that these are the people who are able to vote and this is how you can do it. And that's
Awesome.
just, telling journalism stories, right?
Yeah. Rainesford, anything you want to add, especially on that point about organizers and what we can learn from them? Even if they're aligned in a partisan manner, there's still lessons we can take.
Definitely. I think so much of it comes down, honestly, to listening. As Roxanne pointed out, if this information isn't being given out to young people in school, whether that's because their school doesn't have much in the way of an active civics education curriculum, or if there's been disruption because of COVID, if they're not having these conversations with their parents or with their friends or other mentors, we do have to stop and look at where they're getting their information, and if it's not making it to them, why that's not the case. In terms of this story I wrote over the summer on young organizers, I went through my transcripts and highlighted every time somebody told me they just keep giving us Instagram filters that tell us to go vote. And it was mentioned like 24 times or something just outrageous. And so I think that young people, especially young organizers, young people who are invested in their communities, whether they consider themselves to be political or civically engaged or not, they want to know that their community is as invested in them as they want to be in it. One of my favorite examples of this is the Courier Journal, one of my favorite papers in Kentucky where I'm from, has lots of phenomenal reporters, but their education reporters do a great job hopping on Twitter and talking to young people directly. There have been incredible examples of this around school reopenings and that level of engagement about what the issues really are and how they feel about them. And so I think moving forward, the big question is not debating the question of whether young people will vote, who they'll vote for. I think the biggest thing is just making sure they have the information in front of them that's created specifically for them.
Absolutely. It's just one of those things. I remember turning 18 and being afraid of taxes and learning how to vote, amongst a whole bunch of other things. So I definitely empathize. I want to definitely give room for audience questions. I know we're coming a little bit close up to time, but if anyone wants to unmute or ask anything or drop it in the chat, feel free to do so. We're happy to give folks some time. I know Andrew's also been kind of quiet. Do you have any questions, Andrew?
Well, instead of questions, I'm actually going to put some folks on the call on the spot, if that's all right for those in the audience. Abby, I know you dropped some research and links into the chat from your perspective at Circle at Tufts. If you are still in the call, I know some folks may have dropped off. Do you want to share a little bit about some of the research that you're doing this year around young people's civic engagement and what that might mean for local journalists?
Thanks so much, Andrew. Yeah, hi everyone. This is Abby Kisa. I'm the Director of Impact at a research center that Rainesford shouted out. Thank you, Rainesford. Circle. We're part of the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. And one of the things that we've started to do research on over the past few years is the way in which local media and where young people get their news has an impact on young people's likelihood to engage. And so we were excited to see in 2018 that about a third of young people, including about a third of young people who said they were going to vote, were using local media as a tool for helping them vote. And that might not seem like a lot of young people, and you could look at it either way, but a third of young people is quite many millions of young people, especially when lots of folks think that young people don't use local news. when clearly they do. And that's another thing that we found in our survey research this spring in May, June of this year, when we asked young people, where are they hearing about the elections? And the first and second groups were family and friends. And the third was news websites, right? And so I just want to reiterate that, yeah, there's not all young people are using local news for their civic and political engagement, but there's lots and lots of them. And everything that we see about young people's civic engagement suggests that relationship and trust is important. And, you know, that's why I appreciate what Alan said before in the chat about building relationships with young people early, and then them being connected to your outlet or to your organization for the long haul, which is obviously something that schools do, colleges do, and it'd be an interesting approach for news outlets as well. We're seeing so much engagement among young people this year, but as Rainesford pointed out, you know, the pandemic is really just laying bare another type of inequality when it comes to access to information about civic and political life. And that's what it's doing amongst young people right now. So we're pretty concerned about this and the ability for young people from communities or networks that, you know, don't have lots and lots of connections to do this work. And we think that media and K-12 civic ed are places that can really help in this moment. Did I cover what you think I should have, Andrew?
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Abby.
Okay, yeah.
And I know you shared some links, but if there are other things that you want to share, feel free to do that in the chat. Take a second if folks do want to unmute and ask a question. And if it's okay with the speakers, I just want to, if we can go over maybe a couple minutes if folks do have questions.
Sure.
Roxanne, you look like you're about to jump in.
Well, I have an answer to Doug threw a question into the chat here, asking about sending envelopes with stamps on them to young voters. And actually, in the state of Pennsylvania, everybody who, at least in Philadelphia, anybody who registers to vote by mail is actually getting the postage paid for mailing in their ballots. So it is as legal as the governor saying that it can happen. So unless somebody blocks it, it seems to be happening already.
Thank you for that. Others with questions or comments that they want to make?
Just add that in Ohio, they don't do that, and it's illegal. It's considered paying someone to vote if you provide them that kind of help. I'm trying to figure out, is there a way we can get around that?
I mean, so the paying people to vote thing is primarily that comes up mostly in federal elections. So I guess it's possible that it could get challenged here in Pennsylvania and be determined to be not legal for 2020. But well, no, because it actually happened in the primary. So I don't know why it couldn't happen in Ohio too.
That's a super good example of how some national narratives might get obfuscated at the local level, and how you might hear about one thing about voting by mail that happens in another state that you think may apply. And it's something that we've tried to highlight and talk about the mix-ups when, you know, when national news has that trickle-down effect and local news isn't covering things within a localized context.
So Judah and Jen, you mentioned the election guide that you put together last year for WFAE. Would either of you want to, you know, just talk briefly? You described it as felt like reinventing the wheel, and yet it resonated highly. What was kind of the approach and insight from that?
Jen, why don't you go ahead and take that one?
About the voter's guide last year. Yeah, so we did it knowing that the paper here, the newspaper here that's normally filled that void was not going to be doing those. We were still going to do one, but when we found that out, we realized that it was even more important than ever before. And we sent the the low tech that you were talking about earlier worked great. I made Google Forms and sent to candidates in 13 races, municipal races in Mecklenburg County, and not everyone responded, but most did. And all of those responses go into a spreadsheet. From that spreadsheet, we took that out and made the profiles with the questions that they had answered for each of those races, and saw lots of engagement. We got a lot of emails and tweets, and maybe even a couple of voicemails thanking us for doing that, because it was a good comprehensive roundup of answers from politicians, from candidates that people were not getting, and it was a great resource for them to use as they went to the polls.
I'll just add to that. We currently are in the middle of a survey. So far, we've had about 800 people answer about various topics, but we dove specifically into elections, census, some, political related questions. And it's amazing. Again, the survey just confirms that the most basic information about how to vote, about what even the offices do that are on the ballot. So beyond the candidates, right? Understanding the offices, and we can see across the spectrum, not only with the youngest people, but everybody is rating that information as really important to them. And so the fact that voter guides aren't as available as they used to be. I mean, it used to be a very routine thing for newspapers to do this. I think there's a huge gap that those of us who are going to do those can fill.
By the way, I also think that so sort of taking us out of election season, I think that part of the problem is that there is not as much coverage of just how government works in a sort of the day-to-day basis. And so I don't think people know what the city controller does, because we don't really have as much coverage of what people are doing, right? And so I think that part of our role as journalism, what I think is really important, is if we want to get people to vote and be engaged and understand how their government works, is we have to actually be covering those stories every single week, right? Not just when we're trying to tell people like, oh, by the way, this is what this, the state auditor general does. And so we're filling a gap that maybe didn't need to be filled as much, because people just had a much more general knowledge of how government functions and their role in sort of helping government function.
That's especially true in our community. We have a city manager run city, but we also have a mayor and a county commission. And, we put together a whole proposal around an RFA reporter and a community engagement person to help with this, because there's so much misunderstanding of who does what and how local government works. So we've created that as a beat.
That's great. Yeah, I think there's way less of that. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, I was going to add, I added these links, or I mentioned these in the chat box, but two things was that if you can do something with an official framework, like Citizens Agenda is a popular tool, to like make a concerted effort to solicit questions and feedback from your audience. But sometimes it can also be a little more lo-fi. Like we had on Shy Vote, like the Harkin widget, and then we did a Reddit AMA, but just like paying attention to comments, asking people on social media, asking people in our newsletter, like led to some of our best story ideas that we were able to pass on to reporters, like things we would have never thought to look into ourselves. So I think just like spending that extra time, again, if you don't have an engagement person on staff, then make it part of every editor and every reporter's job to spend like 15, 20 minutes a day, just like actively trying to solicit in whatever way works for your news organization questions. Because like I said, you would be surprised that a lot of the questions were not what we were expecting, and a lot of them turned into more content because we were able to do stories on them. And another example, one of the partners on Shy Vote was Better Government Association, and they have this ongoing series called What the Gov, which is kind of like a comical, like the style is kind of written in a columnist style, but it's just like a civic education kind of explainer thing, and exactly what everyone's talking about, explaining like what the heck does a comptroller do? What is a treasurer? What does a city treasurer actually manage? Like basic how the government works and what power do these people have? And again, they have that as an ongoing series, which I think is another theme that seems to be coming out of this call is like I think the covering elections is always a huge opportunity to engage in some civic education, but folding that into your routine coverage will make people that much more prepared the next time they're asked to vote, so they don't have to crash on learning about all these things in a very brief amount of time. And also the other thing I want to mention is, as much as possible, if you can make these things, whatever you're producing, mobile friendly, because I don't know about you guys, but I've seen a lot of people like pulling out their phones at the election booth, rapidly researching, while they're, probably a lot more people are going to be voting from home this year, but I think just that that can also just facilitate a smoother research process if you're trying to create resources and materials for your readers to make it as mobile friendly as possible. That'll probably give it more legs than thinking of things as desktop products.
Awesome. We should probably wrap it up, folks, but thank you so much to our panelists and to the Solutions Journalism Network and to Craig Newmark Philanthropies for funding our initiative. So many great points here, especially at the end, talking about the way that this cycle repeats itself. We had a conversation with one of our favorite elections reporters, Jonathan Lai of the Philadelphia Inquirer, that talked about, hey, what are you going to do next year when this is all over? And he's like, I've got plenty to do next year. There's the census, there's more municipal elections. All of this is not just something that ends every 2 years or every 4 years. And I think that's an important takeaway from all of this, is that we constantly need to be informing our audiences on that front. But we'll share some links. We'll share a recap via email. If you want to connect with us or any of the panelists, please do so. We're happy to help out. Again, thank you so much for being here, and look out for those links in that email, that follow-up email, and that recording. Bye, y'all.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.